I'm excited to be here today and to have the opportunity. Really grateful to Cooper and everyone else for coming up with the idea of giving me a chance to say a few words. So I have been at Columbia for over 15 years, teaching and doing research, teaching in what is our science core course for all Columbia, sort of, for those of you who know, kind of famous for having a core curriculum, which for over 100 years primarily consisted of studying the humanities. And then 20 years ago, science was added to that curriculum. And I walked in about 5 years into the project. And what we do in Frontiers of Science, we try to teach students how to think scientifically, and we teach them about a range of topics, and those topics change over time. We have now pretty much settled in that we always teach about climate, but we teach about things like the brain, we teach about modern physics developments, we teach about topics related to biology and medicine, most recently pandemics, for example, for their obvious relevance. And it was actually during one of such units on where a series of lectures on modern physics touched on quantum mechanics, nuclear weapons, and particle physics. Anyone who's interested, I can explain some of the logic behind that in a coffee break. But the nuclear weapons one was what sort of took me, just astounded me. Here I was, I had a PhD, I was teaching at Columbia. I felt like I knew absolutely nothing about this. I mean, somehow I knew that we had nuclear weapons, but how many and what they could do, none of it was something that had registered. At that point, I had 2 children. They were about 9 and 5, and I was actually pregnant with my last one. And I remember sitting there thinking, like, I'm bringing a child into this world? Like, what am I doing? And so this turned into, and this was actually the person, I should say, the person giving the lectures was my husband, who's a professor of physics. So there's that too. It's sort of the idea that we had to do something about nuclear weapons almost became like this 4th child of ours, you know, where we sort of came together to really think about ways in which we could just help to educate, you know, initially at Columbia, getting the students involved, getting them active on the issue. And then, of course, that over time has grown. So that was the initial lectures were in 2011. And by 2014, something sort of changed in our line of work. We became interested in the Marshall Islands. And as many people here know, Marshall Islands were the site of, and this was discussed by Betty yesterday, the site of nuclear testing in the 1940s and 50s. And the inspiration for the interest was actually from the nuclear zero lawsuits, which were filed by the Marshall Islands in the International Court of Justice, in the ICJ in 2014, as well as in US national courts. This was a project supported by the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation. It was actually a project that was kind of a joint venture between Tony DeBroom, who's the late Marshallese leader, foreign minister, et cetera, and David Krieger, who was the founder and president of NAPF, who just passed away in December. The 2 of them, it turns out, and this, I think this is a kind of timeless message for students in the audience. The 2 of them were friends at the University of Hawaii as students. And, you know, literally like 50 years later, brought nuclear weapon states to court. And the idea wasn't that the lawsuits were about the Marshall Islands nuclear legacy. The idea was the lawsuits were about the failure of the nuclear weapon states to disarm, which is their obligation under Article 6 of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Again, I'm sorry I wasn't here last night, whether this has come up, but we have, of course, the wonderful, amazing Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, and I do really believe it's going to get us to a world free of nuclear weapons. But before that, the obligation has been there since 68 and 70, when the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty entered into force, the obligation of the 5 nuclear weapon states that are recognized in that treaty to disarm. So Marshall Islands sued. That was dismissed on procedural grounds, but it raised a lot of awareness about Marshall Islands. Told us at Columbia about what had happened there, and led actually to a kind of understanding that the people of the Marshall Islands, to this day, there are certain atolls. Marshall Islands is a collection of coral atolls. There are atolls that were either used for testing or were contaminated during the testing, that are still uninhabited. And the question was, could we go there, and could we, as scientists, try to figure out what the radiological conditions there are like today? And I'll never forget a conversation I had in my office just before the team left for the Marshall Islands. I had a student who came to my office, and she had been looking through all of the studies the Department of Energy had been actually putting out for decades, information about radiological conditions. And she came to my office and she said, I don't know why we're going. And I said, what do you mean? She said, we're not going to find any radioactivity there. And I said, that would be wonderful. That would be amazing. Think of how amazing it would be to go and find no radiation and say, yes, you can go back to beautiful Bikini, go back to beautiful Rongelap. It's time to go back. You're okay. Sadly, you can probably imagine that's not what we found. And so anyway, where did I go from the question you asked? But as a scientist, let me just come back to the main point of your question. We all saw Oppenheimer, right? We all saw what the scientists did. It doesn't matter, or maybe we didn't see Oppenheimer, but it doesn't matter what they thought they were doing, right? And why. They were part of a problem. And I strongly believe that scientists have to be a part of the solution. So that's why I'm here. And yes.
Wonderful, wonderful. Yes. And just one follow-up question I wanted to make sure that we get to, and it really is about scientists being part of the problem or part of the solution. Right? So you are a member of the International Scientific Advisory Group to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which we talked about last night. You know, this is kind of a unique body. What is the role of the advisory group, and how does it really provide a model for how scientists can lead on this issue?
Absolutely. So you heard about the treaty yesterday. It's a young treaty. In January, we celebrated its 3rd birthday. And since I have children and I think about young people a lot, I like to think of things in terms of birthdays, right? So on a child's 3rd birthday, right? You love them, they're amazing, they're adorable, there's so much potential there, but they still need a lot of help. And that's how I think of the TPNW. It needs a lot of help. And so one arm of that help is this new scientific advisory group. We really are very new. We were just established last year. Held our first meeting, and this was kind of amazing, and I don't think it wasn't intentional at all, but our first meeting was on March 1 of last year, which was the 69th anniversary of the Bravo test, which is, of course, this terrible, devastating day that brought so much devastation to the Marshall Islands. But in any case, we have been in existence for a year. Our job is to advise states parties on matters that relate, scientific matters that relate to the treaty. And if I may kind of give my own view of what I think the treaty is trying to do, I really think it's two things. The treaty is trying to eliminate all nuclear weapons from Earth, right? That's very clear. That's the goal. The treaty is also trying to achieve what has underlined so many of the comments and remarks made in the panels today, nuclear justice, right? We're trying to achieve nuclear justice for victims, survivors, people, communities impacted by nuclear weapons testing and use. Now, one can think of those two goals as sort of separate, right? You can think that you can kind of go off and eliminate nuclear weapons and not think about the other goal. You can also recognize that they're actually deeply intertwined, that they're really that there's just such a deep connection. The nuclear justice, the experience of people with nuclear use and testing tells us is part of the reason why we have to eliminate nuclear weapons. And at the same time, what would it mean to eliminate them but not actually address what they have also done? And there was discussion in the last panel about this notion of limited nuclear war. These weapons have already done so much harm, and that really does have to be addressed. So back to the scientists, what's our role? You could think in terms of elimination, simple issues like if a nuclear weapon state joins the treaty, what kind of timeline are we looking at for elimination of nuclear weapons? So a couple of my colleagues on the scientific advisory group have been involved in thinking about this issue. The second is, once they do eliminate nuclear weapons, how do you think about verifying that? How do you know that the weapons are really gone? How do you know that there's no further development happening? So that's kind of this broad area of verification. And, you know, for the moment, and I really do think it's for the moment, I do think they're gonna come to this negotiating table. It's inevitable. But for the moment, we don't have nuclear weapon states in the treaty. And so in some sense, the kind of work we can do today is the work related to nuclear justice. And there, the treaty has Articles 6 and 7, which are meant to, which are provisions for victim assistance and environmental remediation. And unlike other kinds of weapons, and unlike treaties that have, in fact, inspired the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, radiation is complicated. This has also come up today, right? It's not a landmine that you simply remove and you know it's gone. It's not a landmine in that you can assess who is a victim because they're missing a limb or something has happened to them. So how can we think, and I'm not suggesting here that these are strictly scientific issues or that science can provide us with all the answers, but I do think scientists have to be involved in the conversation of who is a victim? How can we think about who a victim is? And how can we think about what it means for environments to be contaminated, to be remediated? How do you do that? So that's some of the work. And I should just say that I do this, of course, with 14 amazing colleagues from all around the world. And we have two co-chairs. There's Yan from Princeton University and Patricia Lewis from Chatham House. And we were nominated by 10 different states parties to the treaty. And we represent at least 13 different countries from around the world. So that's the scientific advisory group. And I'm really excited, actually. Our first year of functioning was very much about, you know, sort of getting, you know, set up. And now I'm hoping we're off to the races to really help move this treaty forward. Because as a 3-year-old, it needs our help.
I think we're going to wrap up there. Thank you so much for making it here, for your efforts, and for being such a great partner and thinker and scientist making a positive difference in this work. So thank you so much, Ivana.
Thank you so much.